Oh, in his rapture, he was weeping even over those stars which were shining to him from the abyss of space, and he was not ashamed of that ecstasy. There seemed to be threads from all those innumerable worlds of God linking his soul to them, and it was trembling all over in contact with other worlds. He longed to forgive everyone and for everything and to beg forgiveness. Oh, not for himself, but for all men and for everything. Welcome to Book 7 of the Brothers Karamazov. And in this beautiful quote that I just read to you, which closes Book 7, did you catch the word that ties it to Book 6 and really to the whole novel? It is the word all. He is begging forgiveness from all. He wants forgiveness from all people. He is in touch with all worlds. This word all reminds us of the elder who said we should beg forgiveness from all and who said we are responsible for all. This Christian cosmic vision is really opening up more now for us in Book 7. So let's look on Book 7, quite a few things to talk about there. There are several different ways to approach it. I think one way, it's very interesting, is looking at what you might call the polarities of the novel in general. And once again, I'm going to turn to our friend Joseph Frank. And I think he makes a good point, just kind of to show us that maybe we're at a crossroads here in this book. He says, if we think about Yvonne's legend, remember that from Book 5, and in Book 6, Zozima's Jiti, they have established the polarities of the conflict between reason and faith. Each of the characters will be confronted by a crisis that requires choosing between them. Alyosha is the first of the brothers to truly confront this crisis, which he does in this book, and which he does overcome. And in this book, as I mentioned kind of in our opening sequence of the whole book, Alyosha has his descent and ascent. Because remember, he literally kisses the earth, but he's going to rise above all of his doubts. And I think it gives us a good reminder about the structure of the book. Because remember, each of the three brothers, their life experiences are foreshadowed by those of the elder. So there is a structural parallel between the unrolling of the crisis situations and the order of the linkage of the brothers with Father Zozima's life. So I keep drawing your attention to the fact that this novel is a masterpiece because of the artistic structure to every little element. And I've only talked about some of them. There's many, but keep that in mind about this structure in the book. So these polarities are important. Also, just to open up the book, we see that Alyosha's temptation follows the second temptation of Christ. And we're going to look at that. But I always want to situate ourselves into Scripture. Both the onion and the wedding at Cana, those two tales embedded in Book 7, have all of the elements of hagiography found in the lives of Russian saints. So there was a book that Dostoevsky looked at that was popular in his time, Lives of the Russian Saints. And this book, this whole novel, follows that pattern very carefully. And these two stories of the onion and the wedding at Cana follow that pattern. So keep that in mind. Also, remember when I told you a couple of podcasts ago about the position of words and text in our novel? Dostoevsky placed so much emphasis on where he would put certain words and which words have authority and which words don't, and which words are actually anti-authority. So we're going to keep returning to that, but I wanted you to keep this in mind. In Book 6, which we read last time, The life of the elder is actually what literary scholars call an expanded quotation embedded in the text of the novel. So I just want to repeat that, an expanded quotation embedded in the text of the novel. That is something that he does. And it's really interesting how this all plays out. So having said that, let's go to question number 1. This is a question about expectations and the elder's death. What do people expect of who they think a saint is and what actually happens? Dostoevsky likes to explore these questions. Now, I put in the question the word expectations. Did you notice in book 7 the word expect? I want you to think about that for a second. This word expect. Because there are many things that happen in the novel that the characters did not expect. I can't find it in one of my books, but one of the scholars actually counted the number of times the word expect is in book 7. It's this big number, I can't remember, but it shows up a lot. And Dostoevsky is reminding us when we're on this journey, when we open ourselves up to God, all these things happen that we don't expect, good things and difficult things. So what about Father Zosima? His body, it doesn't smell like roses as people expected. In fact, even more scandalous. It seems to smell even more and even quicker. So the elder's followers, they expected a miracle after his death. Why? They saw it as his reward for a life well lived. When no miracle occurs and the body decays, the faith of his followers is shaken. Alyosha's faith is shaken and he is tempted to sin. But Father, if you pay attention, he actually told the monks in the previous chapter, don't seek a reward. He had kind of cautioned them against those type of things. Now, you should be thinking of this. Who is it who demands miracles to strengthen belief? Who is it? It's the Grand Inquisitor. And, as Christians, other things we should keep in mind. I just got back from the Holy Land and we were in Capernaum and we had a very dramatic session in Capernaum where Jesus had performed so many miracles, but he left the town in disgust because even though the people saw miracles, they refused to repent. So this question of miracles comes up a lot. But regarding expectations, in this book, we see that reversals of human expectation are woven into the fabric of the story so that we, the readers, will understand they are indeed woven into the fabric of our lives. So this theme of the unexpected, we could do different things with it, right? We see characters who won't accept the unexpected. It's going to lead them to bitterness. But there are other characters who will struggle, who will wrestle with it, and it will lead them to receptivity to reality. That's the ultimate Marian pose. That's what we're always looking for, receptivity. Once a character accepts the unexpected, they can be receptive to reality in all of its reversals. And that will climax with Alyosha and Grushenka. Talk about a meeting of unexpected occurrences. That we will see that there. I think it's interesting in this book how we see a subgroup of people who criticize the elder, and they cannot wait to have an opportunity to say, yeah, he wasn't holy. I think it's wonderful because we see people were waiting to denounce him. I think it is shining a light on the weeds and the wheat in the monastery. And they tell a little story about how there was a monk who was suffering. And while the monk did rely on prayers, Zosima actually counseled him to take medicine, and that scandalized people. What's Dostoevsky doing here? Once again, he is telling people of the 1860s and the 1870s, you have it all messed up, your idea about reason. He believes the radicals have made reason a god. They're reducing everything to rationalism. But then he's also criticizing people who are maybe overly superstitious in their faith, that they won't use simple reason to help themselves. And so I think he's really making a grand statement with those things that are happening. Now, in this encounter of a reversal of expectations, there's a symbol that keeps reappearing in the novels. Did you catch it? It has to do with the sun, this sun in the sky. Do you remember we've talked about that? I've told you how Mitya has a real relationship with creation and the sun, whereas Ivan doesn't know how to. Do you remember the setting sun with Alyosha's mother? Well, here Dostoevsky brings it all together because the scoffer, Father Ferapont, misuses the symbol of the setting sun. He uses it in a terrible way, but it's going to return victoriously by the end of this book with Zosima and Alyosha, because Zosima asks the question, do you see it? And he says, do you see our sun? And he's referring to the setting sun, but to him, it's a symbol for Jesus Christ. When he says, do you see our sun? He is actually, you're not going to be surprised, relying on a poem from, who's our favorite German poet who is haunting this novel? Yes, you're right, Friedrich Schiller. He wrote a poem about friendship. And this is where we think Dostoevsky received the imagery for the setting sun. I have just a short part of it for you. This taught the spheres, slaves to one golden reign, their radiant labyrinths to weave around creation's mighty hearts. This made the chain which into interwoven systems bound all spirits streaming to the spiritual sun, as brooks that ever into ocean run. Can you see here the focus on the sun, but also this idea of water and everything flowing into each other like an ocean? Remember that phrase from last time? You can definitely see how Dostoevsky builds his cosmic vision of the Christian world on German poetry. It's very interesting. So let's now move on to question number 2. We're going to talk about the plan of Rakitin. What was his plan? His plan was for Grushenka to seduce Alyosha. How do we see this tale as a version of the second temptation of Christ? Now, if you remember, Christ refused to demonstrate his immunity to the laws of nature by being unharmed from the pinnacle of the temple, okay? The laws of nature. This is what's embodied in this temptation. Even Father Paisi, who is moderate and stable and well-regulated in his faith and in his emotions, Dostoevsky tells us, quote, secretly at the bottom of his heart, he cherished almost the same hopes and could not but be aware of it. So everyone has this hope that Zosima is going to defy the laws of nature, but he doesn't. And so for Alyosha, this is the opening for him to slip into his temptation. And then if you keep reading, on the one hand, just concretely, his temptation seems to be 3 things: sausage, vodka, and Grushenka. Those are the 3 concrete things. And Radikin's plan is to have Grushenka seduce him. Grushenka is open to seducing Alyosha because her heart has been broken by that Polish officer. She has rage and a lack of forgiveness. And this is a way for her to get back at men, let's say, and to have this type of unholy victory. But it's interesting, if you read a little deeper, and again, I've mentioned before, I'm relying on the analysis of Paul J. Contino. He has a book on Dostoevsky's incarnational realism. He's looking at this novel from a Catholic standpoint, and he says those are not Alyosha's real temptations. He breaks it down and goes a little deeper. He says Alyosha's temptation is a perverse assertion of his will. Did you notice the little clues in there? Because we've seen it before when he met with Ivan. When he has a crooked smile, when he quotes Ivan, because at some point he quotes Ivan and says that he rejects God's world. He's quoting Ivan, and he is giving into temptation. And the temptation that he's giving into, if we look deeper, I'm going to give you that Russian word we always look at. Do you remember? Nadriev. What's that? Do you remember? That is a laceration. So remember, Katerina and Dmitri suffer from these false lacerations. So does Lise. Now, Alyosha is also struggling with his own laceration of the heart. All of Dostoevsky's lacerations, by the way, are in front of an audience. And if you look at first glance, it kind of seems like Alyosha is having his struggle with the laceration with Rakitin, but that's not who he's having it with. Who is Alyosha having his laceration with? He's actually having it with God. That side view, that side look that he's making, he is actually showing himself to God and wanting to hurt himself. Why? Well, remember, Alyosha, just like his brother Ivan, has an idea of higher justice. He has this ideal of higher justice, and the rotting body of his mentor gives him a huge obstacle into believing in God's higher justice. This is why he quotes Ivan verbatim and says he rebels against, quote, his world. Now, through this laceration where he's trying to hurt God by hurting himself, something very important happens. And this is going back to the poetics of memory that I taught you about. In the poetics of memory, all of a sudden, Alyosha forgets to remember. He forgets to remember his brother. He's supposed to be paying attention to Dmitri, but he's angry, and then he's going to be going over to Grushenka's house. He should have been paying attention to Dmitri, although God's going to work it out for good. It is a weakness of his, and this forgetfulness is supposed to remind us of that crucial moment that Ivan will never forget, where he kind of let things happen in terms of the murder of his father. And so they both have this negligence because of the torment that is in their heart. Now, Alyosha is struggling with this temptation. He's going to Grushenka's house, and this is where she's going to give him, of course, the famous story of the onion. But I think it's really amazing how the narrator treats this. The narrator seems to be criticizing Alyosha and saying different things. But then at one point, I feel like the narrator's even questioning himself. He says, that was why Alyosha's heart was bleeding. And of course, as I have said already, the sting of it all was that the man he loved above everything on earth should be put to shame and humiliated. This murmuring may have been shallow and unreasonable in my hero, but I repeat again for the third time, and I'm prepared to admit that it may be difficult to defend my feeling. I'm glad my hero showed himself not too reasonable at that moment, for any man of sense will always come back to reason in time. But if love does not gain the upper hand in a boy's heart at such an exceptional moment, when will it? So the narrator is prepared to excuse Alyosha for maybe having too much love. He has too much love for the elder. He's so focused on the elder, he forgets his obligations to others. It is a fault, but the narrator's prepared to excuse it, because don't forget, Alyosha has this flame of love. And if he's going to have this flame of love to use for the world, he's got to have it in the first place. But of course, it's going to have to be purified. Which it will. So really, obviously, the plan isn't going to work. This plan to tempt Alyosha, it's not going to work, because when he and Grushenka meet, a miracle occurs. So I want to talk about that. That's number 3. Alyosha's vision of Grushenka completely changes. And I think it's important to look at this in all of its dimensions. we're not just looking at the Karamazov family and what's going to unfold. We are also looking at Alyosha's dread of sexual desire. He dreads to look at that woman. He doesn't want to be tempted to see a beautiful woman, and he dreads her. By the end of the encounter, he comes to a real appreciation of her beauty, of her attentiveness to him, of her feminine genius, of even her as an embodiment of the Blessed Mother. All that's going to change. And if you don't read it carefully, you'll miss it. But all that happens very quickly in this dynamic because the both of them are not inherently evil. They both are willing to dig deeper and do what's right. So why do I call this a miracle? I call it this because going back to Joseph Frank, he says, genuine miracles occur in this novel when faith succeeds in aiding the morality of love to conquer egoistic resentment, hatred, and revenge. And so we're going to see that happens in this very dramatic encounter. So when Alyosha goes to see Grushenka, she will become the means of his purification. And we're going to see a lot of ironic reversals, okay? Both of them will mutually experience the unexpected in each other. When Alyosha arrives, Grushenka's surprised to see him, but she smiles and says, "Don't be afraid of me. You can't think how glad I am to see you, my unexpected visitor." In turn, Alyosha, quote, had not expected to see such a kind expression on her face, end quote. His brief, listless bout of laceration is interrupted by her unexpected graciousness. Gradually, his capacity for attention is restored. It says he was greatly surprised to find her now altogether different from what he had expected. And crushed as he was by his own sorrow, his eyes involuntarily rested on her with his attention. Now he's going to look at her. So before he was afraid to look at her because she's so beautiful, but now he's starting to actually enjoy her beauty. And in turn, when she looks at him, it says that there's a light. They become icons for each other. It's very interesting. I think that Grushenka here is pointing to the falsity. If you remember, I think it's book 3, when Dmitri talks about the Sodom and Madonna dichotomy in beauty is one or the other. She is bringing it all together into one beautiful person, beautiful space. And Alyosha had not expected that. In fact, at one point it says Grushenka suddenly skipped forward and jumped, laughing on his knee like a nestling kitten with her right arm about his neck. She says, "I'll cheer you up, my pious boy." Now, sometimes a reader might say, sometimes I've had students say, "Oh no, what's happening here? Is Alyosha being seduced?" Well, what does the novel says? It says, "There was nothing in his heart, such as Radican, for instance, watching him malignantly from his corner, might have expected or fancied. The great grief in his heart swallowed up every sensation that might have been aroused. And if only he could have thought clearly at that moment, he would have realized that he now had the strongest armor to protect him from every lust and temptation." However, if you keep reading, it says, "Yet, in spite of the vague irresponsiveness of his spiritual condition and the sorrow that overwhelmed him, he could not help wondering at a new and strange sensation in his heart." Well, I mean, people can disagree. I don't think it's lust, but I do think it's eros. So he has desire for Grushenka. He's drawn to her beauty and to the female form. And she's still flirtatious, but she's not manipulative and she's not vindictive. And so there is eros, which is just, let's say, a worldly enjoyment of each other. There's eros and there's also agape, because we're going to see that through this, Grushenka is going to have her conversion as well. You know, everyone in this novel confesses to Alyosha, right? And she even kind of is telling him, you know, do I need to forgive? What should I do? This Polish officer, what he did to her, he has tormented her and broken her heart. And she's kind of looking to Alyosha to guide her. But if you noticed, he tells her pretty much, you've already done it, Grushenka. You've already forgiven him. And she does emerge from this Christ-like in her own way because she has decided to forgive that Polish officer. This is huge. And this is going to have implications for the whole novel because it's going to affect Dmitri's life as well. When Grushenka is speaking, Alyosha himself becomes radiant. We read, a light seemed to dawn in his face. This is the transformative power of her beauty. And she's almost like a Beatrice in Dante. I was reading a book talking about how Dostoevsky was so anti-Catholic, but I don't know if he realized in this novel, Grushenka can very much be a figure like Beatrice. Also, did you notice that Grushenka crosses herself? This is a sign she's going to repeat later at the courtroom. Her attention to Alyosha, while she's in the middle of her own crisis, is reflecting Christ's willingness to reach out and help others. Her self-renunciation in this passage is quite remarkable, and all of it culminates in an irony of surprise because each has surprised one another. Just like Alyosha, Grushenka has her own Nadriev, laceration, but her small gesture of active love, her prayerful response to his grief, mediates his emergence from his own laceration. And we have an encounter of mutual healing. And he calls her his true sister. It's amazing how this happens. And keep in mind for Dostoevsky, keep this in the back of your mind. What Grushenka does, really, it's small. Her turning her attention from her suffering to Alyosha's suffering, because remember, she's intent on seducing him until she hears that the elder has died. Then she completely changes and wants to help him. That's small. And that's all it takes, because the small act is the meaning of the onion, isn't it? Which we will look at. So Grushenka is the means of his purification. Memory is central to all of this because I told you he forgot his brother, but then she's going to strike memories, let's say, of his own mother by being an icon as the Madonna. And then he is reawakening. Alyosha is reawakening, which will culminate with the vision at Cana. Through this awakening, he is the re-embodiment of the elder. And so, of course, his vision of her changes. And I love how Dostoevsky puts the change in a sarcastic, ugly way from Rakitin, who says some nasty comment about how she's like a Mary Magdalene. Well, isn't everybody like a Mary Magdalene? Doesn't everyone have to get rid of their 7 demons, let's say, our 7 deadly sins? So yes, of course, she is an icon of Mary Magdalene, and we celebrate it, whereas some of the other characters scoff at it. And we see Eros transformed, okay? The scholar McCluskey has this to say about Alyosha's encounter. He says, Alyosha's visit with Grushenka is the bridegroom's mystical betrothal with his fiancée. So let's think about that. The earth where the law of death and sensuality is overcome by love, and the resurrection is a place where each of them bear each other's guilt. They have to bear each other's guilt. This is going back to the elder who says, all for all. This spiritual regeneration through the ties of common guilt end up transforming them into brother and sister. And all this happens simply by her hearing about the elder's death. So that's done so well. Now, what did you think of the story of the onion itself? I want to talk about the significance of the onion. Remember, I told you there is a hierarchy of stories and text throughout Dostoevsky's entire novel. The poetic system in the book is governed by hierarchy. First, do you remember? We've talked about this before. We have the gospel. Then we have the New Testament, then the Old Testament, Bible stories, the stories of saints and folk tales. This is a folk tale. This is the story of the onion, which interestingly, Alyosha heard a peasant woman in his own life tell this story, and he wrote it down. So it is a real story. And I want to read to you something interesting. This comes from scholar Robin Miller. She says, an onion, like a seed, is a living organism. A slice along its diameter shows its carefully structured and separate layers. To unravel it is to discover that each layer recapitulates all the others. The brothers Karamazov embodies these attributes of the onion, correspondences of which there are literally thousands in the novel, give the novel its surprising unity. So the onion is such an important symbol for the whole novel. It has a meta purpose, but it also is very concrete in this particular story. So the word that Grushenka herself uses is translated in Russian. It's actually fable or story. And it's going to turn into a symbol just like Katerina's bow. It's a daring, bold, and unusual tale for sure. I think if you break apart the story of the onion, it's very interesting. Of course, we see this woman who's wicked, who's going to the fiery pit, just going down. She's done one small thing. But of course, she has to allow others to enter into the full graciousness of the act, and she doesn't. But if you break down the story, there's interesting things to think about. For example, the relationship between God and the angel, it's so simple. It's a very simple relationship between them, and it's actually written in the same way as Ivan's legend of the Grand Inquisitor. So I think we should take the Grand Inquisitor and put it side by side next to the onion. They both have this simplicity, but of course one has truth and the other doesn't. Also, there's the question, who has given whom an onion? Who does that? It's not clear because it's showing us the interrelatedness of all things and all people, just as the elder had said. It's an emblem of conversation, salvation, and joy. Joy is the leitmotif of Book 7. Now, the woman ends up saying, though, right, she negates all of that. She says, it's my onion, not yours. And if you notice, this woman is twice damned. And yet, I want you to think about this. This is a story about damnation. She's double damned. But it's such a beautiful, joyful story. When you're done reading the story, all you come away with is just one small act is enough to save us. Even if we should be damned and we do one small act, it's enough for salvation. Who but Dostoevsky could take this dark tale and leave it so full of hope? That is why he is such a master. Because literally, we forget the lake of fire when we read it, and we only see mercy. A cautionary tale becomes a reminder of the importance of one single act. So the redemptive force of the onion in each of our pasts is enough for salvation. And a beautifully done, this onion is a precursor for the pillow beneath Mitya's head. So remember, we put little symbols here. So the pillow between underneath Mitya's head is going to be a continuation of this theme. Okay, so that's going to lead us to number 5 and the vision at Cana, which is so beautiful. I think we need to read this vision over and over again. Now, remember, I was speaking to you earlier how Grushenka and Alyosha experience eros for each other, not lust, just eros, just enjoying of each other. This theme of eros continues in the vision because it says Alyosha longs, he longs to kiss. He has longing in the vision, but then it says he wants to forgive everyone. Well, that's where eros now turns to agape, into self-sacrificial love. Dostoevsky was so frustrated with the intelligentsia of his day, who rejected the full humanity of people. We have the full flesh and blood of people in this story. So Dostoevsky is showing how you need eros before you come to agape. What is Alyosha's vision? What are some characteristics about it? Well, is it going in or is it going out? It's expanding. It's an ever-expanding vision. Also, it's a paradise that is now. If you remember in book 6, the elder's brother talked about living in paradise now. It is vertical and it's horizontal. All of the outrage, betrayal, and anxiety and longing for justice in Alyosha's heart has given way to an entirely different set of emotions and concerns. The horrors of chapter 1 seem to evaporate amidst the beauty of this wedding feast. And if you remember back to the Grand Inquisitor, there was an implicit rebuke of the wedding at Cana. And then this vision is the answer to that. Notice the importance of the soil, the dirt, the earth that Alyosha has to touch, always remembering we are still on this earth, but there's this meeting of heaven and earth coming together in a beautiful way. Dostoevsky's use of vision is so important and timely that I wanted to spend a moment comparing it to a topic that's very popular today. If you've looked at art from Latin America, I know someone like Frida Kahlo or Diego Rivera. They're very popular in modern literature, particularly novels from Latin America. We have this focus on magical realism. When I was reading this book again, I was reminded of how Dostoevsky has elements of that, but then how he veers in a very different direction. And I think sometimes when we're studying something, this is something I learned studying history, it's really nice to compare and contrast. Having a contrast with two different models, I think, brings out the elements where we can get to the core of something. So I want to compare Dostoevsky's use of vision and in what we see in magical realism. So real quick, let's just look at that. The term in Spanish is el realismo magical. This goes back to Cuba, Latin America. It's mostly associated with a famous novel from 1967 called 100 Years of Solitude. This was written by a Colombian novelist, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was born in 1927. He died in 2014. If you ever study Latin American history, this is the first novel you're going to read. And he was a very gifted writer. He won the Nobel Prize for this novel. In this novel, it's a magical novel. It's full of fantasy, let's say. And Marquez is looking at this little hamlet in Latin America. And he integrates fantasy into everyday. And the characters are controlled by the past. They are visited by ghosts and they cannot escape their doomed fate. This cycle of history, predetermined history, repeats in the lives of the generations. It's looking at 100 years. Now, the author himself, he was committed to socialism and to leftist politics, and he uses creative and dreamlike visions in a brilliant way to show how colonization and imperialism had left people suffering in Latin America. And the solitude signifies this sense of being cut off because they were cut off from the riches of the Western world through some instances of exploitation. And I think it's brilliant how he does that. However, I think where the novel suffers is, where's the hope? Where's the redemption? So if you read this novel, it is beautiful. In fact, you know, we have scenes, for example, where a character is hanging out the laundry and all of a sudden the spiritual enters in and there's these dreamlike visions. So that's really beautiful. But where do we end up? You know, in the novel, there's a sense of repetition and doom. The only hint of redemption is with the idea of maybe a leftist government coming into power. So maybe socialism's the answer, according to this novel. So here's what I want to show you. In Dostoevsky, we have a difficult political situation. We have Russia falling apart at the seams. We have the Tsar being assassinated, and we know we're going to move into revolution. So we have a difficult political situation and the peasantry suffering. We jump to Latin America, this Colombian author whose people have suffered. We have another difficult political situation. And this magical realism is looking to maybe another political situation, fixing it, maybe some kind of political utopia that is leftist. That's really the only glimmer of hope in the novel. And at the end of the novel, at least for myself in graduate school, you end up wondering, well, what's real? Nothing, there doesn't seem to be any objective reality in the novel. It is very much based on subjective, fleeting visions. Where is the hope? So that's how I think a lot of modern authors will use vision. Whereas Dostoevsky says, oh no, I'm going to give you vision. But Dostoevsky's saying my vision is centered on reality. And Dostoevsky does this with the nitty-gritty of the earth. Alyosha touches the earth. Why? Because his elder's body has corrupted, and that's part of being on the earth. And yet we don't stop there. We know there is an eternal reality going on at the same time, but we have to have faith. We have to accept the reversals in our own life to embrace the beauty of that and to believe in it. So Dostoevsky is devoted to reality. Remember, the narrator says Alyosha is a realist. When heaven enters into Alyosha, it is through the natural world. And this is the opposite of someone like Marx, who asserted that the world is not good. We have to fight against it. Dostoevsky believes, like the first chapter of Genesis, it is good. So there's tremendous hope here, a way out of fatalism. So for Dostoevsky, the link between the temporal and the eternal, it's not magic. It's not subjective wishing. It's not a random strangeness. It's not this fleeting beauty. You know, Grushenka has fleeting beauty, but she's pointing to something else that lasts forever. Related to this issue of vision is also the concrete issue of time, because in this magical realism, there are cycles of time that keep repeating, and there's no hope, and there's no change. But for Dostoevsky, there's definitely hope. And I thought it's fascinating how time comes into the novel very concretely. I don't know if you noticed the phrase 3 o'clock. I want to point this out to you. In the book, we read, but before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something took place, something so unexpected by all of us. This is the narrator talking. Later, by 3 o'clock, those signs had become so clear and so unmistakable. So the narrator says 3 o'clock 3 times about the elder. This is what we call Trinitarian recapitulation, because Dostoevsky is telling us God is here with us in time. We are living in time. Right now, I am looking at a clock. I am in time. You are in time. But the Trinity is also here with us, who takes this up and recapitulates it into himself. So that is something much more beautiful, I think, than magical realism. This number 3 is very important for Christians. It's very important in classical literature. For if you study Homer, we know Odysseus hugs his mother 3 times. We know Virgil hugs the character of Aeneas hugs his father 3 times. Dante is trying to hug 3 times, 3, 3, 3, all through classical and Christian literature. Dante takes the number 3 and actually makes it the number 9 for his character Beatrice. So this is how we use Trinitarian recapitulation in literature. Triads dominate. In fact, Alyosha arrives back in the monastery a little after 9 p.m. when all this resurrection is going to happen. By the way, when Alyosha enters the room, did you notice he turns to the right? Because earlier, Ivan had turned to the left. So, speaking of time, looks like my time is up, and I've enjoyed spending my time with you. As you head on into Book 8, keep in mind these very important dynamics between Dmitri and Grushenka. We will see Dmitri's chaos, his feverish state, but be on the lookout for those little areas where he is open to redemption, and where Grushenka is open as well, where forgiveness is going to enter in there and bring the novel a lot of hope. So thank you for joining me, and see you next time.